دوستان عزیز، خانم ها آقایان، شب و روزتان خوش. به نشست 170 کانون کتاب تورنتو خوش آمدید. در این نشست آقای دکتر آبراهامیان درباره کتاب جدیدشون با عنوان بحران نفت صحبت خواهند کرد. از ایشون سپاسگزارم که دعوت ما رو پذیرفتن و امروز اینجا هستن تا در مورد این کتاب صحبت کنند. این نشست قرار بود روز 17 ماه اپریل برگزار بشه، منتها همزمان شد با نشست یادبودی که برای زنده یاد آقای دکتر رضای براهنی برنامه ریزی شده بود و ما مجبور شدیم که این نشست رو منتقل کنیم به امروز. همینطور هفته گذشته با خبر شدیم که متاسفانه دکتر محمد علی اسلامی ندوشن درگذشت ایشون رو از سوی کانون کتاب تورنتو به خانوادهشون و همه فرهنگ دوستان تسلیت میگم. خواهش میکنم در شروع این نشست به یاد این دو مرد بزرگ فرهنگ و ادب ایران چند لحظه سکوت کنیم. سپاسگزارم. عرض کنم حضورتون که نشست بعدی کانون کتاب تورنتو، نشست 171 در ساعت 3 بعد از ظهر روز شنبه 4 جون 2022 برگزار میشه. در این نشست، در واقع این نشست اولین نشست حضوری ما خواهد بود که پس از کووید اولین نشست حضوری است که برگزار میشه. در این نشست 3 کتاب از آقای دکتر حامد اسماعیلیون معرفی میشه. کتاب ها عبارتند از تابستانی با 5 تیر، خاطرات بریده صدر اعظم و کتاب در این خانه برف میبارد، خاطرات یک بازمانده از پرواز PS 752. این نشست همونطور که عرض کردم ساعت 3 بعد از ظهر چهارشنبه 3 بعد از ظهر شنبه 4 جون برگزار میشه در کلیسای آنگلیکن سنت جان یورک میلز، شماره 19 دان ریج درایو. ایمیل خواهیم فرستاد و در شبکه‌های اجتماعی هم اعلام خواهیم کرد، ولی فعلا روز شنبه 4 جون رو در تقویم خودتون علامت بگذارید لطفا. عرض کنم که در سال 2017 دولت امریکا اسنادی در ارتباط با در مورد دوران نهضت ملی رو منتشر کرده و این سندها مربوط به سازمان‌های مختلف امریکایی است، CIA، وزارت خارجه و دیگران. دکتر آبراهامیان به این سندها نگاه کردند و با تسلطی که به قضیه دارن کتاب بحران نفت در ایران رو نوشتن. این کتابی است که امروز معرفی میشه. کتابی سرشار از اطلاعات جدید و واقعیت هایی که برای اولین بار در موردش گفتگو میشه. من با ایشون صحبت میکردم، میگفتن که بسیاری از پژوهشگران آمریکایی این سندها رو که نگاه کردن گفتن چیز جدیدی توش نیست و شاید هم در مورد کودتا چیز جدیدی نباشه، ولی سرشار از اطلاعات جدیدی است که در حال ما پیش از این نمیدونستیم و به خصوص در مورد نقش امریکایی ها در دوران نهضت ملی، نقشی که ما به هر حال تا همین امروز بسیاری از ما فکر میکنیم که حداقل عموم ما فکر می‌کردیم که امریکایی‌ها همراه با مصدق بودن در ابتدا، ولی متاسفانه این کتاب پر است از اسنادی که نشون میده از همون ابتدا آمریکایی‌ها برای تغییر نخست وزیر ایران در تلاش بودن. به هر حال آقای دکتر آبراهامیان در تهران زاده شدند و تحصیلات خودشون رو در رشته تاریخ از دانشگاه‌های آکسفورد و کلمبیا به پایان رسوندن. ایشون پس از سالها تدریس اکنون استاد بازنشسته دانشگاه نیویورک هستند. نگاه موشکافانه دکتر آبراهامیان به فراز و نشیب‌های سیاسی و اجتماعی ایران او را به یکی از برجسته‌ترین پژوهشگران تاریخ معاصر ایران تبدیل کرده است. برخی از کتاب‌های دکتر آبراهامیان عبارتند از ایران بین دو انقلاب، تاریخ ایران مدرن، کودتا، اسلام رادیکال و خمینیسم و نهایتاً اعترافات شکنجه شدگان. کتاب بحران نفت در ایران آخرین کتاب ایشون هست که در سال 2021 به زبان انگلیسی در امریکا منتشر شده. دوستان خواهش میکنم که طبق معمول سوالای خودتون رو در قسمت چت این زوم بنویسید و من سوالها رو پس از گفتار دکتر آبراهامیان خواهم خوند و ایشون پاسخ خواهند داد. آقای دکتر خواهش میکنم بفرمایید.
Thank you. As you probably all know, the U.S. has a rule called the 30-year rule, under which the government is able to declassify and publish internal documents, the 30-year rule being 30 years after the event. So every year, the State Department brings out a volume to U.S. relations with any particular country 30 years before that. So the documents for the Mossadegh period were supposed to come out in 1984. They did eventually come out in 1989, but they were so skimpy. They, of course, had nothing on the coup, but also there were long periods of crisis where there was no correspondence between the U.S. in the State Department and the embassy in Tehran and vice versa. So this flimsy document, although it was 1,000 pages, this flimsy volume created a scandal in the American Historical Association. American diplomatic historians kicked up a fuss and went to Congress and eventually forced the State Department to say that they would publish a new version of the documents for U.S.-Iran relations for the Mossadegh period. This was supposed to come out soon after 1987-89. In fact, it didn't come out till 2017, recently. And when it came out, again, it's 1,000 pages. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
When it came out, the U.S. diplomatic historians dismissed it as basically having nothing new. And the reason they said there was nothing new was because they were looking actually for more information on the coup. In fact, there's very little new to be said about the coup because the famous Wilbur document that was leaked in the year 2000 and was well known basically has a solid objective summary of what the coup was about. So there's no reason to have more information about the coup. But what these American diplomatic historians missed was that this new volume, the 2017 volume, had a great deal of information about US involvement in internal Iranian politics. And I think the reason why these documents were kept secret for so long and the US was so reluctant to publish them is that it shows how absorbed the US was in the nitty-gritty of Iranian politics. After all, diplomats and foreign countries are supposed to have diplomatic relations with other countries, but they're not supposed to be deeply involved in the nitty-gritty of daily events in another country. And it's this taboo that diplomats try to observe was broken in this period. And what this volume shows is how deeply US was involved in internal Iranian politics. To be brief, there are basically three areas where you can see US involvement in internal politics. One is, of course, the famous Siatir uprising and the replacement of Mossadegh by Qavam, and then Qavam's replacement by Mossadegh. Here you can see in the new documents that the State Department and the CIA and Washington as a whole had decided as early as May 1952 that Mossadegh had to be replaced. So there was a meeting, high-level meeting in Washington of US and British, basically experts on Iran, on who to replace him with. And they came up with 16 candidates. It was like basically scrutinizing the CVs of important people and seeing who would be most suitable to replace Mossadegh with. And they came up with basically Qavam as the most suitable candidate, even though he was considered old, had bad reputation of corruption and so on. They considered him suitable mainly because they thought he would be able to muster a majority in Majlis to get elected. And after this meeting, lo and behold, within a few weeks, Henderson, the American ambassador, happened to bump into Qavam after an embassy reception and agreed to have a private dinner with Qavam. And after that dinner, Henderson reported back to Washington that Qavam would be a suitable person because he had agreed that he would come to an amiable agreement about the oil issue. And it was soon after that, in fact, that there was enough of not actually a large majority, but just enough members of Majlis, and in a meeting with which many of the National Front people were not at the Majlis, voted to have Qavam as replaced Mossadegh. And this, of course, created what we all know as Siatir, the uprising. And as a result of the uprising, the Qavam was in fact forced to retire, mainly because the Shah pulled the troops out of the streets. He didn't want the uprising to turn into a great opposition to the monarchy. And to save the monarchy, he basically pulled the rug from under Qavam. And this actually infuriated both the British ambassador and the American ambassador, because they felt that the Shah should have continued supporting Qavam to the full end, even if it meant a bloodshed. A second area where you see American involvement we didn't know about before is what is known as Noe Isfand, 28th of February, when the Shah was supposed to leave the country. The background to this crisis is the Bakhtiari revolt in Char Mahal, where in fact a contingent of Iranian troops were ambushed and some 60 officers and soldiers were killed. Mossadegh found evidence that there was a link between the Bakhtiari revolt and the court, the Darbar. He went to the Shah and threatened to go public with this information, and this would have been, of course, detrimental to the Shah. The Shah agreed that to leave the country if Mossadegh did not go public on this issue. He agreed that on the 28th of February, he would leave with his wife and baggage and 4 advisors and leave the country. Allah, the court minister, in fact, informed Henderson of what was going on, and Henderson arranged basically to have this information leaked in Tehran, especially to some clerics in Southern, and also to clerics who had support among Chaghukeshan. On the 28th of February, instead of the Shah leaving, there was a demonstration, a violent demonstration, attack on Mossadegh's home. And as a result of that crisis, the Shah agreed or announced that he would not be leaving the country. Soon after this crisis, the Shah wrote a personal letter to Henderson, thanking him for having saved the monarchy, because the Shah said if it wasn't for Henderson's intervention, he would have left, and that would have been the end of the monarchy. Henderson actually later, in reporting this event to the National Security Council in Washington, repeated what the Shah had said, and also made sure that Eisenhower understood that the Shah was thanking the Americans for having saved the monarchy on Noah's Fat. A third area, which actually connects all these, is the involvement, which we didn't really know, how deeply the US was involved in the elections for the 17th Majlis. We have records here where the embassy, also the British embassy on its own separately, scrutinized all the candidates, even very provincial candidates, of who was to be running, who was to be elected for the 17th Majlis. And a great deal of money was spent on these elections, both with candidates and also with newspapers, to try and get the good candidates, or pro-American, pro-British candidates. Of course, they didn't get a majority, but what they did succeed in getting is a core of deputies who were basically owed their seats to either the British, the Americans, or the court. And they formed a caucus in the Majlis. Was not a majority caucus. It was basically had enough numbers of members to carry out obstructionism. And here again, you see Roosevelt in Tehran from the embassy advising the actually deputies what to do in the Majlis, which was that since they couldn't get a majority to get a vote of no confidence on Mossadegh, what they could do, and these were the regulations of the Majlis, they could obstruct, i.e., whenever there was an important issue to be discussed in the Majlis, they would find excuses to suddenly go on a pilgrimage to Rome or Mashhad, or to be sick, or to go abroad, so that there would not be a quorum to carry out any discussion or even any bills passed. In fact, by end of the Mossadegh period, the government had some 300 reform bills, including reform of land, reform of the electoral system, of the judiciary. And every time the government introduced these bills into the Majlis, these obstructionists would leave the chamber. The quorum, there would be no quorum. The government came to a standstill. It was the result of this obstructionism that Mossadegh eventually had to basically resort to non-constitutional methods to take a referendum to dissolve the Majlis. In fact, a majority of the deputies resigned from the Majlis, but again, there was a quirk in the quorums, in the Majlis regulations, that a resignation of a deputy could not be accepted unless there was enough members of the Majlis there to accept the quorum. So even if a majority resigned, that resignation was not approved because there was no quorum. So Mossadegh really resorted to the referendum, which then became a cause célèbre for the opposition, for the royalists to claim that Mossadegh was becoming unconstitutional. So these are three areas that you can say is new from our knowledge of U.S. involvement in internal politics. But these documents also reveal actually something additional. Additionally, they also show that the whole controversy, which we had for many years, that this coup occurred because of intransigent of Mossadegh about oil issue, and that the U.S. had offered a good agreement, a good compromise, that U.S. had offered to accept nationalization, but it was Mossadegh who was intransigent. And what these documents show, in fact, actually, I think reinforce what we already suspected before, was there was never really an offer to Mossadegh accepting nationalization. The American proposal was a very clever one, in which, in theory, the U.S. accepted the principle of nationalization, so long as Iran did not actually control the oil industry. So it was a meaningless nationalization, where we could say the national Iranian oil company would run, let's say, the cafeterias in Abadan, run the swimming pools and the golf courses, and maybe even the schools. But the real decisions on how much to drill, who to sell to, what price to do, that would still remain outside Iranian hands. The British obviously wanted it back in British hands. The Americans proposed a consortium of both British, American companies, and maybe some French running it. And this is what eventually, of course, happened. So it puts to rest, I think, these documents puts to rest this old controversy whether the U.S. was really an honest broker in the conflict between Britain and Iran. Another thing that the documents put to rest is the idea that communism was really a live issue for Americans, and the British may have wanted the coup to get oil back, but the Americans were really afraid of communism. And here, although officially the people like Roosevelt claimed communism was the threat, if you look at the documents, especially the CIA documents, and they're actually quite detailed documents, even one given 2 weeks before the coup by CIA observers of the Two-Day Party, they all conclude basically that the Two-Day Party was in no position to carry out a coup. It was not even thinking of a coup. It was, in fact, supporting Mossadegh. And they even argued that the only way the Two-Day could come to coup would be through the electoral process, that the two-day had 2.5% of the electorate in 53, it would have taken them a couple of 100 years to get enough of electoral support to have a coup. So the CIA own evaluations was no threat of a two-day coup. There were also some discussions about the Soviet threat. And again, the CIA and sometimes the State Department was mystified that the Soviets were so uninterested in Iran. And because they were so uninterested in Iran, they claimed that there must be something devious about this. They must be doing something that they were not interested in Iran. So these are actually, I think, important evidence that the document presents that has bothered historians, and there's been a debate back and forth how much communism was an issue, how much basically U.S. was an honest broker in the whole controversy. Another issue that actually the documents are striking is that inside the U.S. government, there was you can say, to use a modern term, a deep state. Under Truman, although the Truman administration wanted to replace Mossadegh with someone more amiable, they were not thinking of a coup. They were thinking of a political process, of somehow through the political process replacing Mossadegh. But what you find, interestingly enough, is right from the beginning, even before Mossadegh was elected in April 1951, there were diehard people in the CIA who very much thought, very much like the British, that the only way to deal with it is not to negotiate with Mossadegh and get the Shah to replace the Mossadegh with someone else. So right from the beginning of the Mossadegh administration, there was a core of people in the CIA, mainly Dulles, Roosevelt, Helms. These were the people who did carry out the coup in 53, but they didn't come into the CIA with Eisenhower in 1953. They were there in running the desk, the CIA desk on Iran, even in April of 1951. So what you got is an interesting behind-the-scenes tug of war between these die-hard, basically pro-coupists who were Republicans, and the more down-to-earth State Department officials, people who were actually, many of them academics and later became academics, who were arguing that basically there was no communist danger, that Mossadegh could be negotiated with. And anyway, they gave a sociological, basically, answer to the diehards. They argued that the National Front and Mossadegh really represented the rising middle class. They were the future of Iran, and the US should try to actually negotiate with them rather than overthrow the regime. So you have this back and forth, and every time there comes to writing a document, a national intelligence estimate, which US does on each country every so often, there's a constant tug of war, what paragraph to put in. The diehards, like Dulles, wanted to argue a paragraph put in about a communist danger, that the Mossadegh administration was about to collapse. And the more cool-headed State Department officials would argue, no, that's not true, that the administration is quite stable and we can negotiate with them and there's no immediate communist threat. So this goes back and forth. And of course, eventually, after the Eisenhower comes in, the State Department, the more cool-headed people are forced out of the State Department. They go into academia, end up in Princeton and in Harvard, and it's the Allen Dulles and the Helms and the Roosevelts who take over. Now, another factor that I think is very surprising, at least it was to me, is in these discussions, what was the main holding back of a coup was not so much the principle that the Truman administration on principle was against the coup. That argument was never actually raised. In these back and forth debates behind the scenes, the main argument that the more cool-headed people had was that a coup cannot succeed unless the Shah supports the coup, and the Shah had made it clear that he did not support the coup. And here the Shah actually comes out in a very different light. Later on, the perception, especially after 79, was that the coup was like, the Shah was like a Hamlet figure. He couldn't make up his mind. He was weak. He was cowardly. He was inconsistent. But what these documents show is that actually right from the beginning, the Shah was actually quite adamant and quite perceptive and much more political savvy than most of his advisors and also the foreign diplomats. He argued, even this is in April of, in May of 1951, he said, if I go against Mossadegh, if I go against National Front, if I go against nationalization, I will basically delegitimize the monarchy. I will delegitimize myself. I cannot go against what is basically the national aspirations. So every time people said to him, you know, get rid of Mossadegh, he actually didn't have the constitutional right to do that, but they misunderstood the Constitution. Every time they said that, they said, I cannot do that because that I will delegitimize the whole monarchy. And he persisted on this line right through to the very end. It was not till early September of 53 that the Shah gave in, mainly because he was given an offer that he couldn't refuse. He was told that the CIA and the MI6 were going with the coup, whether he was on it with it or not. And after the coup, there was no way that the US and Britain could guarantee that one of his brothers would not be replace him as Shah. And that was, there were actually two brothers who were quite eager, angling for the job. And this was a clear threat, something that basically eventually forced the Shah to participate in the coup. So in fact, I would say that in this way, he was quite perceptive in that from that day on, after the coup, the monarchy was lost its legitimacy. And this was something that always hovered over the Shah for years on end. And to find the roots of the 79 revolution, you already have to tie it to 53. When the crisis, small crisis occurred in 78, 77, it was actually a small economic crisis, a question of human rights. Any self-respecting state would have survived those two minor issues. But the Shah couldn't survive that, mainly because the regime was so fragile. It didn't have legitimacy. And here you find in 1977, 78, US embassy officials writing back to Washington saying that the Shah has trouble negotiating with anyone because the opposition leaders do not consider the Shah as legitimate. Now, these State Department embassy reports at that time can't say why the Shah is illegitimate, because to do that, they would have to go back to 53, something they don't want to actually tie 79 to 53. But you find later, actually, a more recent book by William Polk, who was an official, State Department official in 53, and throughout the 70s, he was an advisor to the State Department. He wrote a book in the 80s about introduction to Iran, and he's the first State Department official who actually admits explicitly that the Shah could not survive 79 basically because he didn't have legitimacy. And the reason he says the Shah didn't have legitimacy was because of the 1953 coup. So here, linking directly 79 to 53. So I would argue that these documents, although they were dismissed as having nothing new, are a goldmine of information on actually what happened between 51 and 53. And the US involvement is very much there to be basically scrutinized. And it was because of this involvement that countered, in fact, what State Department officials are supposed to do in their host country. It breaks the taboo. And it's for that reason that these documents, in fact, were kept secret for so long. And there are two documents you can actually compare. So simply, same document that appeared in the old version of the Foreign Relations of US and then the new version. The two documents are there. In the first one, there's basically three areas where it says ... i.e. things were still kept classified in the 1980s. In the new document, you find that these ... are actually quite short, like not even a sentence long. They're there. And what they say, in fact, what reveal is that US involvement or contact with internal forces within Iran. And they, in fact, basically revealed that what the US in 1980s was so sensitive about, so cautious about, is they didn't want to admit that they were involved in internal politics of the Iranian situation. So I would say that these are very valid for historians to look at Iran through these documents. Now, one often says that, well, diplomats, politicians lie. You can't trust them. It's rare that you actually have a politician that outright lies. Nowadays we have people like Trump, but a good politician and a diplomat doesn't lie. They can mislead, which is very different. You can mislead someone by clever use of the language, and more important, not putting on paper things that are important. You could put a lot of things on paper that are not important, but the most important issue may not be put on the paper. So someone looking in a document say, okay, US was interested in, or accepted nationalization, but if you don't know that their use of the meaning nationalization is different from the normal use of the word nationalization, you miss the point. So there is, I think, if one uses documents or government statements, scrutinize it and knows the context, documents are a valid way of understanding what happened in history. One shouldn't dismiss them as basically pure propaganda. The statements public statements may be propaganda, but what is put in actually internal documents, whether it's a CIA evaluation of the two-day party or the National Security Council meeting, internal meeting, those documents should carry a lot of weight in trying to understand what happened. A final point is often the name of Kashani comes up. That's this focus point of often the opposition, that Kashani was the person who really was the American tool in bringing down Mossadegh and so on. What these documents actually show is that there is no basically involvement of Kashani in the coup itself. Kashani had very close relations with Henderson, but he was used very much in the Majlis politics, in the obstructionism and trying to undermine Mossadegh in the Majlis. But in the actual coup, there is no evidence. In fact, the evidence points out to that he was not involved in the coup itself, which is interesting because there's one long document on the actual coup, which was sent to London. There was one paragraph that was kept secret until much later. This was revealed more recently. That paragraph points out that the CIA money that went into the coup, especially to the Chagokeshan on the day of the coup, was in fact channeled through Ayatollah Behbahani. There was no mention of Kashani there. And the document says the whole enterprise of the coup was very closely secreted. Only very few people were in the loop. The intention was basically to succeed by having very few people at the top involved in the coup. And Kashani is never mentioned. So to me, that's pretty much assurance that Kashani was not involved. But it's not because Kashani was against the coup. It's because the CIA and the British didn't trust him enough to have him got involved in the coup. They preferred Behbahani. And of course, we know that the money that was spent in Tehran was known as the Behbahani dollars. They weren't known as the Kashani dollars. So I think that should put to rest this whole issue of how Kashani, I think it's a sort of red herring in the whole the coup discussion. So I'll end there and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abrahamian. Very important information. دوستان لطفاً سوالهای خودتون رو در قسمت چت این برنامه زوم بنویسید. من سوالها رو مطرح خواهم کرد. ضمناً این نشست همزمان در کانال یوتیوب کانون کتاب تورنتو در حال پخش هست. و نکته دیگر این که لطف کنید، من در قسمت زوم خواهش کردم که برای کمک به این نشست ها کمک های مالیتون رو از ما دریغ نکنید. ایمیل کانون کتاب تورنتو و لینک سایت رو گذاشتم که اگر لطف کنین به ما کمکتون رو بکنید. تا سوال ها برسن من یک سوال مطرح میکنم. دکتر آبراهامیان، شما خب گرچه که در کل نهضت ملی قضیه ملی شدن نفت خیلی مهم هست، ولی در جریان قیام 30 تیر مصدق این قضیه نفت رو گره میزنه به مسئله قانون اساسی و کنترل ارتش و وزارت جنگ. میخواستم در این مورد اگر ممکنه یک کمی توضیح بدین که مصدق نظرش در این مورد، در این زمینه چی بود و چگونه این کار انجام شد و اختلافاتی که با شاه پیش آمد سر وزارت جنگ.
Yes, I mean, it's a good issue because it actually brings together the whole question of oil nationalization and the question of the constitution. Mossadegh like many other constitutionalists, including actually surprisingly Ravam, had always been concerned about who controlled the military. According to the Constitution, the military should have been under the war ministry, and the war ministry, of course, should be under the prime ministership. And any constitutional monarchy or system usually has the civilian supervision over the military. The Shah, however, and here again you see the Shah as a very actually adamant and consistent person. The Shah, from the day he became Shah in 1941, was adamant that he should continue controlling the military as his father had done. So for him, the army, all the armed forces were basically his private turf, and politicians were not supposed to venture into his turf. Ravam actually early on tried to appoint his own minister of war. At that time, defense was known as war. And the Shah had actually managed to defeat him on that. But this had remained a sore issue among constitutionalists, and Mossadegh himself had always said, his, of course, famous slogan was the Shah should reign, not rule. And for him, the military should be under civilian, i.e. prime ministership supervision. So this had always been there. Of course, during the nationalization period, the question of nationalization became predominant. But in the Seatir period, when Mossadegh got wind of what was going on in Majlis, that this opposition caucus was trying to get Ravam prime minister, and there were, in fact, some people from the National Front who were working with Ravam. Probably someone like Gerایی was working with Ravam at that time. What Mossadegh did cleverly, he brought the issue of the military control into the picture, and basically reshuffled the cabinet, appoint the Minister of War and actually renaming it Ministry of Defense. And this confronted him with the Shah, and the Shah, of course, was very much against such a loss of the supervision. So what the Shah was here doing, what Mossadegh did cleverly, he lumped together the question of nationalization and the constitutional issue. So Seatir became both an issue about oil and also the constitution. And after Seatir, of course, Mossadegh won both issues. He managed to get rid of Ravam, who was willing to sell out the oil issue. But he also got control for the first time, really, from 1921, that the Shah was not able to appoint the chief of staff and the war minister. And that, of course, was for the first time really since the 1920s, you had the civilian supervision of the military. And that, of course, again, made the Shah very concerned about his own future, but still he was not willing to go against the Mossadegh nationalization openly.
Thank you. I have a question from a participant. They are saying, به نظر شما حزب توده اشتباهاتی داشته که در سرنگونی مصدق تأثیر داشته؟
Yes, definitely. I mean, here again, there's some actually muddying of the waters. The two-day party mistake was in the early period of Mossadegh, not fully supporting oil nationalization, but talking about nationalization of southern oil, implicit that northern oil was separate, even though there was no northern oil, but still. And this is often argued that the two-day party was therefore in opposition to Mossadegh. The fact is, by Siatir, the two-day party had changed its policy and was actually was supporting Mossadegh. And you could see this in actually how they described Mossadegh. In the early period, they viewed him as somehow a representative of or an ally of American imperialism, while later on he became, after Siatir, and especially even Noé Esfand, much more as a person who was a national leader. So that when it came to actually Bistoheshte Mordad, there's also much, I think, distortion of it. What we know of the two-day party at that time, they were very much following any line that was set by Mossadegh. They didn't want to cross the line. So when Mossadegh asked his supporters to stay out of the streets, they stayed out of the streets. Later on, the CIA then tried to create the notion that the two-day party undermined Mossadegh by not coming out into the streets on Bistoheshte Mordad. But the reason they didn't come out on the streets was because they were listening to Mossadegh's advice not to come out into the streets. So they were, in fact, supporting Mossadegh at that time. But you can argue that in the earlier period, the policy was a mistake. And actually, it would be wonderful to get into the archives of the two-day party to find out what were the discussions between in the early period. My suspicion is that some of the more, I think, down-to-earth peoples like Iraj Iskandari had supported Mossadegh from the beginning. And there were some, I would say, ultra-leftists who were talking about a revolution and Mossadegh being a bourgeois representative and undermining Mossadegh. But these, I think one needs to get into the internal documents to find out what was going on behind the scenes. But I think from what we know from Iraj Iskandari, he would have been, I think, a full supporter of Mossadegh from the very early on.
Thank you. A participant is asking, چرا CIA در سال 57 وارد عمل نشد؟ آیا این به این دلیل هست که دستاندرکاران آمریکایی از برژینسکی، گریسیک، اویزر و سولیوان هر کدومشون ایده های مختلفی داشتن و نهایتاً این ایده های مختلف به بیعملی رسید؟
Well, by the revolution period, the situation was very different. Somehow, because they were able to carry out a revolution, a coup in 53, doesn't mean in 77, 78, 79, the CIA could have carried out a coup. I think the whole opposition field was very different. You have mass revolts basically in all the cities. You have a much bigger crisis than in 53, or mass mobilization than in 53. And there's another thing that often forgotten is after the CIA coup, the Shah was very pro-American. There was probably no political leader who was more pro-American than the Shah, but that doesn't mean he trusted the Shah. The Shah trusted the Americans or the CIA. According to the Shah, everyone was a threat, especially army officers, Secret Service. You could even say paranoid, but even paranoids have real enemies. So it wasn't purely imaginary. So what the Shah did in the 1960s and 70s was made sure that the CIA really did not have much infrastructure within Iran or even much knowledge of what was going on in Iran. So the line the Shah took with the presidents of the United States, whether it was Democratic or Republican, his line was that I know how to run my country. I don't really need basically the CIA to tell me what's happening. And the CIA was very much restricted in even collecting information in Iran. The CIA had a presence in the north collecting information on Soviet nuclear tests and up in Central Asia, but the CIA really was not involved in internal Iranian politics in the 70s, even in the late 60s. So it was very ignorant of what was going on in Iran. And you can see this when the revolution started. The CIA and the embassy in Tehran did not even know who were the political leaders, who to talk to. They had to scramble to find out who was Sanjabi or who was Bazargan, because there was really no knowledge of internal affairs. And this was mainly because of the Shah's distrust of the CIA. And you have a funny story about basically after the revolution, the head of the CIA was sent to Iran to investigate. And as soon as he went out of the embassy compound, he got lost. He had no idea what Tehran was like. He had no map of Tehran. So the possibility of the CIA carrying out a coup in 79 or any time in the 70s is just imaginary. And I think the Khomeini knew this perfectly well, but it was useful to have this image of 53 in front of people and say, the US is still a threat and carry out a coup and therefore break relations with the US or take hostages. Because in the public mind, and I could say in the public Iranian culture, 53 had left such an imprint that it was basically a false imprint, but it was still an imprint. Another thing that's actually important here is you would imagine that the army officers that carried out the coup in 53 would be heroes. But in fact, if you look at their careers, you find that most of them were eased out by the Shah soon after the coup. He didn't trust even the officers that had carried out the coup in his support, because his view was that if these officers carried out coup on my behalf for the CIA, they could carry out a coup for the CIA against me in the future. So he was basically eager to get rid of most of those, and he did so. By the late 50s, most of them had been forced out.
Thank you. Freydun is asking, in your earlier writings, you have referred to some sort of socio-cultural hypocrisy as the backdrop to the political affairs in Iran, such as Hezb Tudeh at the start was not accepting non-Muslims as a member of the party. How elites and politicians' double standard and lack of social agency within the public had been a major cause for political upheaval, in the country.
Well, I'm not sure where I've mentioned that non-Muslims were not in membership. I'm sure there's a misreading of what I've written. No, I mean, I wouldn't estimate socio-psychologically, or I wouldn't call it socio-psychological, socio-economic factors. It's true that this book is dealing with documents, therefore it's dealing purely with politics at the high level instead of sociological history. But one doesn't have to be one or the other. I think both are compatible. In the 60s, there were historical wars between, let's say, political history versus socioeconomic history. But that's passé. I think nowadays most people would say both are equally valid. It's just what is the question you're raising. And if I'm raising the question about US involvement in Iranian politics, I think it'd be a distraction to go into much into socioeconomic history. You're dealing basically on the top levels of elite history and political diplomatic history. So I don't think it's one or the other. I think the question is whether you have a question you want to discuss and explore rather than what area of history you look at.
Thank you. A participant is asking, please comment if there was anything that Mossadegh could do differently to change the outcome.
Yes, of course, this is often raised the question, could the coup have been avoided? Yes, I think Mossadegh, despite, again, conventional wisdom that he had lost a lot of support, there was great deal of instability. I think the documents again showed that the regime, that he still had a lot of support. And even the documents say that after the coup, he retained much of his support. So the system, the administration didn't collapse because of failure. I think it was the collapse or the coup occurred mainly because Mossadegh was not willing to resort to force. Mm-hmm. And this is very much part of his personality. He was very much as a constitutionalist, or to use a modern term, a product of the Enlightenment and the Constitution. He was not willing to resort to bloodshed to remain in power. And if he had, I think on morning of Bishtash de Mordad, if he had called his supporters into the streets and taken the advice of some of his ministers, armed some of his supporters, this could have forestalled a coup, or it could have led to a civil war, but he was not willing to go that far. And you can see this often, the first failure of the first coup, Nasiri's coup. One of his ministers recommended that they should be rounded up and shot. And Mossadegh thought that was a ridiculous suggestion. How could he go and shoot some officers who had presented the Shah's farman at his doorstep? That was against the law and the constitution. So I think that was partly it. And I think there's a miscalculation also that Mossadegh relied on his chief of staff, Gerayi, who had assured him that he had the situation under control and that the military could not be able to actually, would not carry out a coup because he thought he had basically coup-proofed the 5 garrisons around Tehran. And as long as he controlled those garrisons, there would not be a possibility of a coup. In fact, what the CIA did, and this comes out in the Wilbur report very clearly, the CIA and the British were able to basically short-circuit the proofs that Gerayi had put and bring the tanks into Tehran. And of course, once the tanks were in Tehran, they went to get Mossadegh.
And a follow-up question here. In a recent interview, you referred to some revisionists in looking at the Nehsat Milli and the issues around it. I just wanted to ask you if you could briefly tell us what were the پیشنهادایی که دادن, the offers from World Bank, the Americans, and so what were those پیشنهادات? Briefly, you mentioned that these were basically empty nationalization. Basically, if the Iran was not in control, they were okay. But what were these offers that Mossadegh rejected, and now some people are calling it a mistake?
Yeah, a good point, because this is, again, puts the onus on Mossadegh and depicts him as being basically intransigent. Now, if you look at the World Bank offer, it's seen as basically acceptance of nationalization, and therefore Mossadegh, Iran got what it wanted. But if you actually look at the World Bank suggestion, it's not that. What it said is the World Bank would run the oil industry for 2 years, i.e., it would be not now. At the end of the 2 years, by then, the International Court would decide basically how much compensation Iran was to give to the oil company. Okay. So then the question really hinges on compensation. Now, Mossadegh was willing to give compensation. In fact, the nationalization law in the Majlis had a clause saying that compensation would be paid. You can't just nationalize industry. There has to be compensation but that's standard law. So the giving of compensation was not an issue. The question was, what was the compensation to be based on? Okay, so Mossadegh was willing to pay compensation, but he wanted to know if that compensation would be based on the value of the oil industry at that time or some imaginary figure in the future. And the British line was that it should include the future losses to the end of the concession, which would have been 30 years beyond or so. So what that meant was, and the Americans actually said that would be an astronomical sum, huge sum to be paid. And that would have put Iran basically in a debtor's box for the rest of the century. And of course, he couldn't accept that. So Mossadegh argued that give me a sum or base it on the value of the industry at that time when we'll negotiate. And the British refused to do that. And in these discussions against, the US sided with the British. Eisenhower himself actually said that there should be fair compensation basically on a value of future losses. And when the World Bank presented this, in fact, they checked it both with the Americans and the British before they presented it to Iran. So it was cleared by the other side. And interestingly, it's separate from the volume I'm talking about, but there's a CIA report that's also revealed separately. A memo from Farmoyan, actually, to the US State Department, saying that Mossadegh would never accept agreement if the compensation is not stated. If you present him with a future losses, he will never accept it. So they knew from the beginning that they were offering Mossadegh an offer he would never accept because it was too open-ended. So here again, actually, it's important because documents at face value seem sort of basically clear-cut. But when you put it in a context, it's not really an offer he could have agreed to, because it was basically, I would say, a trap. And after, if he had accepted that and the compensation had been that high, no country in their right senses ever in the future would ever want to nationalize, because they would be bankrupted for the rest of the century.
Yes, thank you. باقر is asking چگونه حزب توده با داشتن سازمان گسترده مخفی نظامی در ارتش نمیتوانست کودتا کند، همانطور که کمونیست‌های افغانستان در سال 1978 کودتا کردن و قدرت رو به دست گرفتن. این در اشاره با صحبتی است که گفتین که مدارک خود CIA نشون میده که حزب توده در شرایطی نبود که بتونه قدرت رو به دست بگیره.
Again, this is a question that's often raised, and it's of course sounds like a convincing argument that today had a Sazman Afsaran, and of course it was discovered, unearthed soon after. 600 officers were in fact court-martials. 600 officers sounds like an impressive amount. Why didn't they carry out a coup? It must have been either because they were conspiring with the British or it was a bad decision. But again, put it in context. 600 officers, is that a big sum number? The officer corps in Iran at that time was 60,000. So 600 out of 60,000. Then if you look at these officers, and you can see it, of course, in the court-martials, very few of them were in positions that they could actually carry out a coup. They were mostly either teachers or junior officers, NCOs, or more importantly, many of them were actually were in the provinces. You can't carry out a coup in Baluchistan or Sistan. You had to be in Tehran in the tank officer corps. Mm-hmm. And this is no accident that these officers were not in important positions. We have from other British diplomatic reports the indication that as soon as the British invaded Iran in 1941, they started monitoring the Iranian military very closely. And they could easily identify who was a leftist officer. It was easy to identify an officer who didn't take bribes or what newspaper they read was easily identified as having leftist views. So what they did with them was they relegated them into provincial positions where they would not be a threat to the government. So you find many of these officers that look impressive, there might be a colonel or a major, were in fact not in a position to carry out a coup. A few exceptions. There were, I think, 2 officers in the who had access to tanks, but they didn't actually command tanks in Tehran. And ironically, there was one officer in the G2 intelligence who, again, was obviously giving information. And ironically, he could have been in a position to assassinate a Vice President Nixon when he visited. But the Tudeh party wasn't in the business of assassination, so they didn't use that asset. But they never had the position to carry out a coup. And the British, in fact, were quite were assured there was no possibility of carrying out a coup a 2-day coup in Iran. So again, this was a camouflage that was often used, that if you have so many officers, you can carry out a coup. It just was not feasible.
Thank you. A follow-up question. on page 75, you refer to a document from British Treasury memo on March 1952 that they are advising Americans to use the communist boogie whenever communicating with the Americans. That's what they basically encourage that. So my question here is, how come all these years, most of the researchers who are researching this, they missed this point, and they basically bought into the idea that, oh yeah, it was, one of the reasons for the coup was the danger that Iran was falling behind the curtain wall.
Yeah, even actually when the British said use that bogey, it's not quite who they're referring to. If talking to the American press, that bogey would work because, this is a Cold War. People are looking for communists under every bed. So under Iranian beds, there might be a lot of communists. But when you're making decisions, high-level decisions, when you're talking to someone like Dulles or Helms or Roosevelt, these are hard-nosed politicians. When they look at the possibility of a coup, they're looking at, let's say, what are the assets? What are the forces there? They're not talking about general notion of, let's say, how many people you bring out to the street or even have a demonstration. So these hard-nosed people are not going to be persuaded by the bogey. They know it's a bogey. So if they use that argument, they have other agendas. Mm-hmm. And I would say the real agenda is the oil agenda. Yeah. But you're not going to be able to go to the public or even to yourself and say, my real issue is security of oil. Yeah. It's much nicer to say, democracy is threatened. The evil Reds about to take over, and we need to do something about that. So, the two Dulleses, if they wanted to throw their grandmother under the bus, they would have always referred to, we had to do it to save the world from communism.
Yeah, definitely. And again, I want to, because it is really related here. Again, on the same page, you are referring to the famous NSC 68, Truman's foreign policy guidance. If you could please just throw in a couple of sentences explaining what that is and how this was used.
Okay, that was the main policy, let's say, blueprint for the Truman administration foreign policy, basically to orient American policy against the Soviet expansionism. Containment, what became known as containment. Mm-hmm. And therefore, any important foreign policy had to conform to this containment of communist threat. So if you are a diplomat and you want a policy, it would be, I would say, diplomatically convenient to tie that policy to this blueprint. So I think someone like Henderson, it would have been smart for him, any policy he had, even if it was not to do with the Soviet threat, to tie it to the Soviet threat, because then it could say, I'm pursuing what is the general agenda of US foreign policy.
And that is how basically they use this to engage in the coup and other activities.
Yes, and also you find, again, this comes into documents. You have to sort of read with documents with caution. Mm-hmm. The documents may start off with saying, there's a communist threat and so on, but then what the document inside says has nothing really to do with the introduction. Mm-hmm. So I say in the book, actually, it's a bit like, Islamic statements in the name of God, the compassionate, and so on. But what's in the actual document may not have anything to do with the introduction of the document.
Great example. Thank you. Sasani is asking, who were the people who were pulling down the Pahlavi statues during between 25th and 28th of Mordad?
Again, actually, I mean, the argument often was that it was Tudeh who tried to undermine Mossadegh by this outpouring of anti-Shah, anti-monarchist sentiment. If you actually look at what happened at that time, as a revulsion against the first attempted coup, there was an outpouring. It was as much National Front supporters as Tudeh supporters. They both joined in a statue breaking. And in fact, Mossadegh was asked by one of his ministers again to say something or to discourage people not be out. And Mossadegh's answer was, well, people were angry and they need to let off steam. So he was not going to force people back out of that. The only person I know who at that time from the National Front who opposed the statue breaking was Khalid Maliki. But otherwise, I think the general sentiment was that. Then the question was, in fact, what was to happen once the Shah left? And some people from the National Front were talking about a republic. The Tudeh talked about a democratic republic. But Mossadegh himself wanted a regency council to basically determine what was to happen. Again, he was going very much more as a constitutionalist rather than calling for the abolition of the monarchy.
Participant is asking, آیا سندی در دست هست که نشان دهد چرا شاه بعد از کودتا مصدق را اعدام نکرد؟
Well, there were people who actually wanted Mossadegh executed, especially Zahedi. The reason he probably did not is because there was a great deal of still, I mean, not still, but continued support, popular support of Mossadegh. And this would have, in fact, been counterproductive. It would have further undermined the monarchy. So the resolution was to give him a death sentence, then be sort of magnanimous, give him a prison sentence, and then put him in house imprisonment. That way, make him a non-person. But execution would have been, in fact, I think, very counterproductive in that. And actually, they're not in these volumes, but in British documents that have come out for 1954-55, they're actually quite honest in saying that the Mossadegh is still very popular. And some people, even some reports say even more popular than before, and the regime was very unpopular. Mm-hmm. There's a very interesting report by Lambton, who had actually supported the coup. She takes a tour of Iran after the coup, and her reports are astounding on how unpopular the Shah was and how corrupt the regime was after the coup. So execution of Mossadegh would again, a smart move on the Shah not to do it. But his hope was that Mossadegh would become a non-person. Literally, his name was not mentioned in the public from after the trial until the revolution of '79.
And a follow-up question while we are on the Shah subject. In your book, you touch on another well, I would call it quote unquote myth that so far people believe that Shah, when he started his after Reza Shah left, he was really a constitutional monarch, and then gradually he became a dictator and so on and so forth. But you have referred to some documents in this book that it demonstrates that from early on he was really getting, he wanted to get the whole power, all of it, and nothing left for anyone else.
It's not only actually in these documents, the British diplomatic papers that were released much earlier, they show that the Shah was adamant that as soon as he came to the throne, that he would basically retain as much as possible. He had to release some things. He couldn't control the Majlis, but he spent a lot of money in getting deputies in the Majlis. He also made sure, as I said, that no one would venture into the military aspect, that basically that would be his preserve. So I think, and also, I mean, even before the assassination attempt in 49, he was trying to lobby both with the Americans and the British to get more power. They discouraged him. It was after the failure of the coup, where he had some popular support because he was seen as a victim, he got the Constitution Assembly to give him more powers. But he'd been wanting those powers even before the assassination attempt. So he's very consistent that if for him to remain in power, he had to have real power. It couldn't just be the nominal titular head of the state.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
By the way, about Switzerland, the argument that, well, he had studied in Switzerland, he was therefore a Democrat. First of all, Switzerland was not a very democratic society in the first place. And the school he went to was not full of Democrats. It was really sons of elites from America, from Britain, from Europe. And I also would like to point out Kim of North Korea was also educated in Switzerland, actually longer period than the Shah. So that argument about somehow Switzerland had dropped off on him is mythical.
Thank you. Dr. Atabaki is asking, have you also consulted documents about Churchill's visit to Washington in 1952? In this meeting, the threat of communism was highlighted by the US.
Yeah, I haven't looked at Washington archives, the ones that I look at, the ones that are actually published. I'm sure there would be 50 documents again highlighting communist threat. The question is what's inside the documents, not what the introduction is, and what is the context. In 52, of course, the height of nationalization, is there real fear of communism, or is the real fear that nationalization is a contagion that is going to spread to other countries, including America, concessions in, let's say, the Persian Gulf, Venezuela, Indonesia, and so on?
Thank you. There are a couple of questions are not directly related to this period, but I'm going to ask them anyways. Participant asking, did the United States do anything to prevent the 1979 revolution?
Well, again, the premise here is that the US had the ability to prevent the revolution or to encourage the revolution. The fact is, as I said earlier, the CIA really did not have the infrastructure or even the knowledge of what was going on in Iran in 79 to do either. So you had, at the height of the upheaval, General Heuser is actually sent there by Carter to find out what's happening. And once he arrives there, of course, Heiser knows nothing about Iran. He has to ask the people around. And of course, the generals are saying, let's carry out a coup. But then he discovers that no one has actually done anything. The generals expect him, Heiser, to organize a coup. They don't even have the fuel to run their trucks. Heiser has to arrange fuel to be sent to Iran so the Iranian army would be able to actually even move around the country. So the idea of the US being able to do anything at that time is basically imaginary. Another thing that comes out actually is staggering, is that Heiser, when he arrives in Tehran, discovers that the general staff of Iran under the Shah had never met. So the first time the chiefs of staff actually have a meeting is when Heiser is there. So how can you carry out any type of coup if the chief of the army doesn't talk to the chief of the Air Force, and they don't the chief of the gendarmerie or the Navy? And the Shah, as a massive assurance that there would be no military coup against him, had made sure that these chiefs of staff communicated only through the Shah. Not horizontally, they could only communicate vertically. Mm-hmm. So it was not a military that could carry out a coup, and the Shah basically was responsible for this dysfunction. And the idea somehow the US could wave a magic wand to either carry out a coup or stop a revolution is just not there.
A follow-up question. You pointed out an important fact that these chiefs of staff and other leaders of the army, they were never met and discussed or anything. So was the same situation correct in 53? Or so? If yes, then the expectation that Heiser could organize a coup was right, because in 53 they came in and they coordinated everybody and facilitated communication and all, so on and so forth.
Yes, but the situation is so far different. It's one thing to carry out a coup where you have, let's say, 100,000 people demonstrating. But it's another thing to have a coup when you have 2 or 3 million people in the street. So let's say even if the Heiser has coordinated the military, first of all, by then the military was not really that functional. Many, a great deal of desertions. Yes. Throughout 1977, 78, when there was a lot of killing in the streets, it was not actually that unlimited killings. It was often the shooting was done by officers, not rank and file. If the army had asked rank and file to actually shoot into their often neighbors, family members, and so on, there would have been basically a mutiny. So the Shah made sure that it was actually limited amount of killing in the streets. My estimate of how number of people killed during the revolution, the official figure is 60,000 people killed in the demonstrations. The actual figure is more like 600. Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's a lot, 600, but it's not 60,000. So the army, even under the Shah, had limited capabilities of doing it. The only part of the army that could have carried out some sort of coup were the Imperial Guards. But when you look at the size of the Imperial Guards, yeah, they could have gone into the Tehran, basically taken over the Prime Minister's office, taken off the telecommunications. But what do you do after you do that? It's like a dog catching a car. They could do that, but who's going to run the whole country? Who's going to run the oil industry? You have a general strike in your hands. And this was a question actually raised with Häuser. Häuser said, yeah, we can carry out a coup. But then when the question was, what does that comes after a coup? Who's going to run the economy? And once then there's more outbreaks, then would American troops be needed to stabilize the situation? Häuser actually admitted at some point American troops would have to be introduced into Iran. And this was, of course, a no-no for Carter. There was no way Carter was going to accept actually U.S. Troops on the ground in Iran. So the idea that somehow there was a possibility of the Americans organizing a coup just wasn't there. And Brzezinski was the one who was calling for a coup, and he was getting advice from Zahedi. And interestingly enough, the Shah tells, I forget, it was either Sullivan or the British ambassador, he says, don't listen to Zahedi, he knows nothing about Iran.
Thank you. Feridun is asking, you rightfully called Reza Shah pseudo-modernist despot and his son as patriotic despot. What would you call Khomeini or Khamenei? Again, this is one of those questions that is not directly related to the period, but as I said, I'm going to ask them anyways.
I would call them theocratic autocracies.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Another participant is asking, is there any similarity between oil deal in 1952 and the nuclear deal these days?
Oh, well, the similarity, which of course I think especially Ahmadinejad argued, was that in oil nationalization is a right of Iran. Mm-hmm. And having a nuclear program is also a right of Iran. But the question becomes if nuclear program includes nuclear weapons program. And it might be a right, but in I think international basically reality, if every country has a right to have a nuclear weapon, then you get basically making the planet a more dangerous place than it already is. So if Iran has the right to have a nuclear weapon, why not Azerbaijan? Why not Armenia? Why not Iraq? You know, every country then has a right to have a nuclear weapon,
including North Korea.
Yes, I mean, that's the big, I mean, the ones that already had it is one thing, but then proliferation to every country becomes a very dangerous situation.
Yes, thank you. Behruz is asking, can we still characterize the 57 revolution as an anti-imperialist and democratic one?
The 1979?
1979, yes.
It's definitely not democratic, but anti-imperialist, yes. I mean, the word democracy is often used as just being purely popular. But of course, Adolf Hitler was also popular, but I wouldn't call him democratic. But if you're talking about democracy respecting the natural rights of individuals, then obviously what comes out of 1979 is not democratic.
Thank you. And on that, a follow-up question on the question of democracy. What is your personal impression if Mossadegh was not really after oil? I mean, if the question in 53 was not oil, but democracy, and basically establishing a constitutional democracy the way Mossadegh wanted. Do you feel that we would still have the coup d'etat in 28 مرداد?
Well, I think for Mossadegh, the oil issue and democracy were, I think, intertwined together, because for him, independence and constitutionalism went together. Azadi, the word azadi meant not only national independence, but also individual freedom. I don't think he would have seen this contradiction. But the second part of the question was,
if it wasn't for oil, it was just for democracy, would the Americans and the British or anybody else in the world would have interfered and stopped it?
Well, it wouldn't have concerned the others if it was just an internal issue. But I don't think you could separate the issue, because to have independence, you had to have basically sovereignty over the main natural resource, oil. So leaving the whole the basis of the economy in the hands of a foreign company would not be a democracy. So I don't think you could separate the two.
So they are really integral part of each other.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Another question I have, in the book, you refer to some documents that about the killing of Afshartus, and maybe Gurایی had something to do with it?
Yes. I mean, at that time, after Afshartus's murder, Gurایی was arrested and questioned, and he then took shelter in the Majlis. So there was a link there. And one of Gurayi's basically accomplices pointed his finger to Gurayi as being implicated in that. Gurayi's argument was that this statement from his former colleague was under torture. It's hard to imagine that under Mossadegh, especially under Ministry of Justice, Lufti, there was torture used in prison to get a confession. So I think there was a good, I would suspicion that Gurayi was involved in the assassination.
And a follow-up question, based on your research and all these documents that you have seen and your previous books, how come a personality like Khalil Maliki associates himself with a figure like Gurayi in Hizb Zahmatkeshan?
Well, Khalil Maliki is a complex figure. I think he's genuine socialist, but his anti-communism becomes an obsession. Mm-hmm. And is in many ways motivated more by anti-communism than socialism. And here again, you don't see a smoking gun in the documents, but there is enough scent there to suspect that it was the CIA that encouraged Maliki to work with Gurayi. Because the documents often talk about, the CIA boasts that they have helped create a Titoist movement in Iran. And obviously the Titoist movement means the Hizb Zahmatkeshan. And the two basically were willing to, in their anti-communism, be there. And Khalil Maliki's, some of his actions, in fact, helped undermine Mossadegh. Now, whether willingly or unwittingly, he helped in the coup. I can't say he actually participated in the coup, but certain things he did, I think, helped undermine the movement. For instance, on the anniversary of Siatir, when the Tudeh wanted to have a joint meeting with the National Front, and in fact, much of the National Front were willing to do that, it was Khalil Maliki who insisted, no, there should be a separate meeting. So one was in the morning, one in the afternoon. And this was then used by the American press to argue that there was a communist threat, because then they claimed that actually the two-day demonstration was much bigger than the National Front. Although at the time, Etelaat said basically the size of the meetings were more or less the same. So also, Khalil Maliki was not in the government, but he was adamant that there should be no alliance with the Tudeh party. And this, of course, helped the CIA attempt to weaken the Mossadegh administration. So I think where the breaking point came between Khalil Maliki and Baghai was Khalil Maliki, when it became obvious that Baghai had moved openly against opposition, moved into the opposition, was in fact denouncing Mossadegh as a British agent. At that point, there's no way Khalil Maliki could have continued supporting Baghai.
Do you suspect that Khalil Maliki possibly was aware of this mingling of Baghai with Americans and CIA and others?
It could have been. It would have been hard for not to know, because actually Baghai was constantly having meetings with Loy Henderson. Loy Henderson thought Baghai was off the wall. Baghai would talk about, all sorts of philosophical issues that had nothing to do with the situation, but they had long meetings. And the reason Henderson was meeting Baghai was in order to basically draw Baghai away from Mossadegh and holding out the hope that Baghai would become prime minister. The Shah was also doing the same with Baghai.
So Baghai probably have been identified as an important factor to cause disturbance and split the National Front and separation of some against Mossadegh.
Yeah, Baghai, actually, the CIA documents say that Baghai didn't have much support in Tehran. It was in Kerman.
Yes.
But he did have links with Chagukeshan. And also the CIA documents actually admit that when there was violence in the street, although the public argument was that the Tudeh created the violence, the CIA actually admits that it was usually Zahmat Keshan who created the violence. They had the incentive to create the violence. For instance, the demonstrations when Harriman arrived, the big demonstrations of quite a few people were killed, the CIA documents actually admit that it was Zahmat Keshan and Chagukeshan that actually created that disturbance, and then the blame was put on the Tudeh party.
Thank you. One last question, and that relates to 1979. Like for example, during this period in the 50s, we read that American embassy is meeting with all sorts of political figures like Baghai, like everybody. They have meetings and they get information and they give them directions or suggestions or whatever. But after Amini left power, Shah forbids any contacts with embassies, including American embassy. And don't you think that this was one of the reasons that caused a disconnect between Americans and activists in Iranian politics? So when 1979 is happening, they don't know anybody. They don't know Bazargan. They don't know, who are the players and how to talk to them.
Yes, definitely. I mean, I think ignorance played a part. But the image is that, of course, America is omnipotent, all knowledgeable, knew everything. And because it was able to carry out 53 coup, it could have carried out a 79. Again, I said, repeated myself, the situation was very different. Not only on the ground, but American knowledge of Iran was very different.
Was very different. Great.
Yes. I'll give you just one example.
Sure.
There was a meeting in the Foreign Council here a couple of years ago, and there's a person who had been running the American embassy in Tehran said, well, we really didn't know there was so much unpopularity of the regime. Okay. And a woman got up and said, I was in the Peace Corps in Iran. Did the embassy ever bother to ask any Peace Corps person what people in this? And the embassy person said, no, we never consulted the Peace Corps people.
Exactly. So it wasn't Shah's fault or anybody, but that was the way it worked.
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor Abrahamian. Really appreciate your time.
And thank you for
once again for speaking for us. And everybody, دوستان عزیز، از همه شما هم سپاسگزارم که وقت گذاشتین در نشست امروز شرکت کردین. این نشست در یوتیوب خواهد بود و دوستان میتونن نگاه کنن. از همه شما سپاسگزارم. نشست بعدی ما همونطور که عرض کردم شنبه 4 جون و معرفی 3 کتاب از دکتر حامد اسماعیلیون. Professor Abrahamian, the last word is with you, please.
No, thank you very much for this opportunity. But there's still many questions to be raised and questions. Yes. But thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.